Hey guys, it's Justine here from I Should Read That, and today I am bringing you a review of one of my most anticipated books of the year. This is The Final Girl Support Group by Grady Hendrix. So before we get started, I just really quickly wanted to say I received a digital copy of this book from the publisher Titan Books for review. This obviously doesn't influence my opinion on the book whatsoever. Also, I'm going to do my best to keep this spoiler free, but I may talk about some plot points along the way. If you want to go into this knowing as little as humanly possible, I would go ahead and turn back now and come back when you've read the book. So, you can probably tell by the tone of my voice throughout the beginning of this video that this ended up being a huge disappointment for me, and I wanted to talk a little bit about why. So I am someone who really enjoys kind of like the classic horror films, and I really enjoy certain parts of the horror genre, although I am an absolutely huge wimp. So this book was one that I was really excited for because it takes the concept of the final girl, the last girl standing in the horror film, usually the one who ends up killing the killer and sort of saving herself, and turns it into like a real life concept, kind of twisting sort of like the sort of film franchises and all of that. Great, loved it. I love that concept. I love his books. The Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires is one of my absolute favorites, and I recommend it to everyone. So I was really looking forward to this, but this book just did not click with me. So in this book we follow a character named Lynette, and she is the one telling the story from the first person. So in this book, you have to kind of stick with me a little bit here. The sort of final girls are real people. So these real massacres that happen, and there is a sole survivor. This was a big phenomenon through the 80s. There were just these mass killings, and there was this one girl left standing. And so now in the present day, they are all together, they meet together, and they have this kind of like secret therapy group. So in this world, because of these sort of like huge news stories that these events sort of generated, film franchises have been created. So you kind of have like the Nightmare on Elm Street, you have the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, but they're called different things, and it's a whole thing. You have to kind of stick with me on that one a little bit. It's a very cool concept. I really love that. But basically we follow Lynette. She's going to this support group. She is living her life in absolute terror. The way she lives her life is really, really tragic. She's completely isolated. She lives in this apartment that's basically like completely like locked down, totally secure. The only relationship she has is with her houseplant. And when the story opens, we find out that one of the final girls, who's kind of the original, her story is based on Friday the 13th, is murdered. And Lynette begins to realize that someone is coming after the final girls and killing them off, but because she has this kind of like these deep mental and emotional issues because of her past trauma, people don't believe her, and she goes on this whole big journey to try to save herself and save these other women. All of that is great. Really enjoyed that. But there were a lot of things that didn't work for me. So this book is basically a love letter to the slasher flicks of the 80s, which is great. So we have all of these girls, all these final girls who are women now in their 40s, are inspired by, I think, Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Nightmare on Elm Street, Friday the 13th, and others that I can't remember off the top of my head. One of them is Halloween, and I absolutely adored that. I thought that that was really cool, and he uses those women's stories and our fascination with sort of this intense violence against women and sort of this stalking and often sexual violence against women as a way to sort of critique our love of these movies while still sort of paying homage to them, which was really interesting. And I really enjoy the way that he talks about social issues in his book. So for example, in the Southern Book Club's Guide to Slaying Vampires, I always get that title wrong. I always stumble over it. He talks about these 90s housewives and the issues of like medication and sort of like the idea of like the stay-at-home mom and sort of being powerless in her own home, and that was really great and really well done. It felt really ham-fisted in this book. It felt really disingenuous, which was really surprising to me because I think he does a really, really good job, especially of talking about women's issues and things that impact women, people not believing women when these things are happening, people turning against women, women having to be sort of fit into these like perfect little boxes. And it just didn't work in this one. In terms of the plot and characters, this book felt really quite shallow, and I keep talking about Southern Book Club because that book also featured a group of women, older women, who have been impacted by these sort of like huge events in their lives, and they just felt really shallow. And I'm sure there's some kind of like parallel you can draw between like the sort of the trope of the final girl and how she's defined by her trauma and she's defined by this thing that happened in her life and the way that he wrote these characters. But honestly, he's really good at sort of inverting those kinds of tropes, and I think it was a really huge opportunity for him to give these women some depth. And it just wasn't there. They felt like caricatures, they felt like cardboard cutouts, which again, you could make the argument that that was intentional, but I just don't think it works. And honestly, I'm a little bit disappointed in him for that because usually his women are really three-dimensional. Lynette, who is our main character, and as I think I said, she is a first-person point of view character. She's the only point of view character we have, so we see the story directly through her eyes. She's a very secretive person, and of course, as you would expect, we sort of uncover what happened to her and how it continues to impact her, and sort of the events of her sort of final girl incident, and what happened immediately afterwards, and sort of things that she may have repressed and all of this stuff. She's got a lot going on, but she's such a secretive character that I felt like there was this barrier, this wall between me and her that I just couldn't break down. And while I obviously sympathize with a woman she's such a sad and tragic character, because as tough as she is and as strong as she is trying to like live her life, she is such a isolated and frightened woman, and like I wanted to love her so much because I get that. I really, really understand that, and I would have loved to have seen more from her, and it wasn't there, and I actually find that really upsetting and disappointing. Everyone kind of felt like a pawn being moved around for the story's sake. There were a couple of interesting characters in here, but there was no one that really stood out and felt like they had agency, and I think that's what was missing for me from this book, was this lack of agency that would have empowered these women and would have made them more than just pawns in the story, and would have made them more than just characters being defined by their trauma and this horrible thing that happened to them. Again, I feel like I get what he was going for. I totally understand, and I understand the movie tropes and everything that he was going for. I just didn't think it worked. So ultimately, this book was a sort of fast-paced love letter to slasher flicks. I wish I had loved it. There's so much here that I desperately wanted to love, but ultimately it just fell flat for me. I'm still gonna keep reading his books because I really, really enjoy them for the most part, but I guess every author has to have a little bit of a miss. I gave this book 2 out of 5 stars. I finished it, which already bumps it up to a 2-star. I did very strongly consider DNFing it a couple of times, but I was so certain that he would turn this around, and he didn't, and like, oh, it makes me so upset. So I would love to hear in the comments below, if you have read this book, let me know what you thought of it. It doesn't matter if you agree with me or you disagree with me, I just really want to hear what you have to say. I would also love to hear if you have any horror recommendations for me, because I really, really enjoy horror books. That's something I'm trying to get a little bit more into. I post bookish content to this channel fairly frequently, so go ahead and hit subscribe, check back soon, and I will see you next time.